of the code in order to produce the results that we see on our machines. Whether that's a PowerPoint application, whether that's Zoom, Skype, Slack, or in the enterprise world, there are enterprise level applications. The whole industry revolves around the coders and their piece of work. Coders' piece of work, their art is to write programs and produce applications. Applications in result solve some problems. For example, when you go to a banking, a Chase Bank or Bank of America, when you go see that teller and you deposit your cash or check, they are using some sort of application, right? Some sort of application to log this transaction for you when you come to the bank and to deposit your money. This application, ladies and gentlemen, is running on top of some OS, and the likelihood is it's running on top of Linux. And this Linux, ladies and gentlemen, sits on top of your hardware right over here. This could be a Dell server, it could be an HP server, or some other brand. That's not important. This is your hardware server, and it has these resources: CPU, it has RAM, and it has another resource, hard drive. There are other components too. There is a power supply, for example, that sits over here that powers this whole box over here. There's probably some fan sitting on top of the CPU, and a heat sink basically is to cool down the CPU, right? So at the end of the day, as a system administrator, as a system engineer, as a DevOps engineer, you need to be familiar with the app structure, you need to be familiar with the OS, you need to be familiar with the hardware. But when you go to work at an enterprise level, you're not touching every single thing. You're not responsible for every single thing. So therefore, there's a lot of diversity in this domain. You might be just working on the OS, installing, configuring, and maintaining the health of the OS. And OS means operating system. Or you may be responsible for some app, the app that I told you, the banking app, it's a enterprise level application. They will need to hire some application guys. They're going to teach them their application, how to work with this application. If it doesn't work, what to do, how to troubleshoot some of the networking issues, right? And then the same thing with the OS. If the OS does not work, or it stops working, or if the server is slow, how do you resolve that? And then the same thing on the hardware level. If the hardware goes bad, how do you make sure that this server continue to run? And checking the resources on your server, that is also part of your job. And for us to understand and be able to come to this app level and have the OS level of understanding, I talked about certain functions in the operating system right over here. Once again, those functions are, how does the operating system do the memory management, CPU management? How does it stores the data on the hard drive? How does it store the data on the hard drive? And that's a file management. Okay. In the file management, we need to understand, using Linux, how do we create files? How do we create folders? How do we organize our data? How do we access our data? Who can read to file? Who gets permission denied? What is a user on Linux? What is a group on Linux? How do we apply group permissions? How do we apply user permissions? Data is everything. And so the first thing that we're going to learn on the Linux operating system is the data, how to manage your files, how to manage your folders, how to create new files, how to create new folders. And that's where you're going to have the hardest hard time, because somehow the structure, the way the Linux file system structures, if you understand the tree, you will have to understand that tree, how the data gets stored. And then from there, you will learn commands, to go from one folder to another folder to create a file, to modify a file. Like I said, Linux is colorless. Linux it does have a graphical user interface, but you will not be using graphical user interface. We will not even introduce you to graphical user interface because we want to teach you something called CLI, and that's what the interviewers ask you questions on. How do you create a file? Give me the command for that. How do you create a directory? Give me a command for that. How do you manage your users? So these things are very, very important. So we're going to learn about the file system management. File system management. What does that mean? Once again, how do we manage our files that reside on our Linux operating system? Okay. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm not using my traditional mic, so there might be some echo in the background. Okay. So we're good so far. And also, remember I told you the Linux interview question number 1 is somebody said this microphone is better. Okay, great. Linux has 2 parts, the architecture of Linux. It has a shell. Right? It has a shell. The shell interacts with the kernel. And the kernel usually manages your hardware, server, resources. For example, CPU, RAM, and your hard drive. Kernel interacts with the kernel interacts with the hardware, and the shell interacts with the kernel. And you are over there, you're an entity that basically logs into a Linux, and you interact with the shell. So what is shell's job? Shell is an interface between you and the system. Shell is the interface between you and the Linux system. It gives you access to perform certain actions on your Linux system. Okay? So we need to keep that in mind, okay? Can you send us the presentation by email? No, I'm sorry, we cannot send you the presentation. Presentation will be made available to those who transition into the Linux DevOps program because we do not have the capacity to send out that many emails, right? And so you just learn over here for 4 weeks and take your knowledge and see what you want to do with this knowledge. All right. So, and then we talked about different types of operating systems, right? We talked about Linux, we talked about Unix, we talked about Windows, we talked about Mac, and we talked about how they are different from each other. And there is one major difference between all of these operating systems, and which is what? What's the mentality between that major difference? What's the heart process behind that? How is Linux different from Windows? This is another question. This is another question an interviewer can ask you. How is Linux different from your Windows operating system? Windows operating system, because Linux is an open source operating system. And I gave you guys right over here the definition of the open source. Open source is a software that can be freely downloaded, used, modified, and redistributed. There's an organization which is called, I believe, GPL, General Purpose License. That's under the open source initiative. So back in 1991, Linus Torvalds, the inventor of Linux, Linus Torvalds, he decided that the operating system should be free for everybody to use. And therefore, there was only one operating system. There was a Windows operating system too, but he was a big fan of Unix operating system. He wanted to create something, equivalent to Unix operating system, which was the world's first network operating system. So he looked at the Unix operating system. He liked some features of the Unix operating system. He developed something called Linux. And his methodology, his mentality was that operating system should be free for everybody. You go simply buy the piece of hardware, whether Dell, HP, or whatever machine you like. You bring it home, you have an option to decide whether you want to use it with Linux, you want to use it with Windows, you want to use it with Mac, you want to use it with Unix. So what he did was basically he developed the first free operating system, and he made the source code available to the public. And now source code is the very code that basically the Linux is written in. The program itself, the millions of lines of program was basically made public, which was never the case before. Companies, Microsoft, companies like Sun Microsystem, company like HP, they were the makers of Unix operating system. They were really enjoying their profits because Unix operating system, their source code was not available to public. So what's the big deal about the source code? Well, everything is about the source code. Every application that you interact with today, they have a source code. That basically means there's a main code that somebody wrote. They have an option whether they can show you that code or they can not show you the code. For example, we use Microsoft Office products and Windows. Do we get to see the source code of that application? No, it's a closed source application because Microsoft does not want you to copy their source code, and therefore you cannot make modifications to the application behavior as well. Let's say you wanted to add certain features. You're a smart enough developer, and you know that you can easily modify the source code with a few lines here and there, and that would change the behavior of the application. You do not have that flexibility. With the Linux operating system, you have the access to the source code, and therefore you can modify it and you can call Linux any name you want. It would be a Linux, but then the Linux has different distros. Distro or distribution. The word is distribution, but in a IT lingo, we call it a distro as well, what distro you're using. So therefore, we see a lot of distros in the market. For example, Red Hat, for example, Oracle, for example, there is a CentOS, there's SUSE, there is Kali, there's a Mint, there is Ubuntu, and many more. So these are different variations, different distros, different distributions that exist today in the Linux world. How come we have so many Linux distributions? Like I said, Linux, Torvalds gave you the first Linux kernel. He developed the first kernel. People downloaded. Smart people like Red Hat, Oracle, they saw a huge potential over there to create their own organizations. Red Hat is $1 billion market, which is sitting on Linus Torvalds' main source code. So they downloaded the code, they hired a bunch of developers, they made modifications, and they called it Red Hat. And they had a great marketing strategy. Therefore, in today's world, when you see the enterprise, this is the main distribution in North America that your Fortune 500 companies or enterprise level companies use Red Hat distribution. But if you go to Europe, you'll see SUSE is being adopted a lot. So because they have a better marketing strategy over there. So Red Hat is a very popular operating system choice or distribution choice or a flavor choice among companies in North America. But Oracle is also catching up. Oracle also has that market share. But in Europe, you'll see that they use Suzy a lot. And on a non-commercial level, for example, small companies, mid-sized companies that do not want to pay money for the sport, but they want to use Linux, our home users, our small businesses, they use something called Ubuntu. And it's a very great operating system. It's free to download. If you have a spare desktop, if you have a spare laptop, you want to play with Linux, I suggest you start playing with Ubuntu. You're going to have some fun with Ubuntu. Okay? Is every distro like is every distro like a different form of kernel? So remember, every distribution has the main kernel, So basically, they make cosmetic changes to the operating system. They change the color, they may add some more utilities over there, but the kernel is actually the main thing, is the same or similar. They use that, and the utilities on top of that. What is your favorite? What flavor you are comfortable? Or CentOS? They will ask you this question that we use this in our environment, and are you comfortable with this? So open source, ladies and gentlemen, is the game changer over here. Not that open source only gives you the access to the source code. It opened up a whole different era for the information technology, and the softwares. There's a new this initiative of open source. It's getting so popular now. Every company, it's a trend now. Any company that comes up with a new software, they like to make it open source. You know why? Because open source has no hidden agenda. Open source software has no hidden agenda. Let me give you an example, hidden agenda. Back in, I don't remember the year, but there was a one version of Windows operating system. Chinese government and companies bought the Windows operating system, and they started running Windows operating system on their systems. And who's the maker of the Windows operating system? Microsoft, which is a US-based company. Guess what? They sold them the version of the Microsoft operating system, which was spying on their systems. It was actually shipping the data back to the US through the back door, and they were spying on their systems, what they were doing. They happened to see large amounts of data being shipped through their routers and switches, and that's how they realized that something is wrong with this type of the Windows operating system that they were running on their systems. So they immediately stopped using those systems, and because it was closed source, they couldn't even go inside to look at the code. They couldn't even tell what this system was doing. So, the tools for war is changing as well. It's an era of information technology, and if you're the top information technology, if you got the top talent, you control the world. The next war is going to be cyber war, God forbid, and it's going to be a really nasty one, because now everything runs on top of your Linux operating system. For example, the grid station, the electricity system, they're all based on Linux operating system. So if somebody has control of your the very system that's running your grid system, they can basically take out the electricity in your towns and in your cities, and therefore cybersecurity is a big thing now. And with the presence of metaverse, Facebook and Instagram, our lives are online, and they need to be protected. And unfortunately, there are not that many people who understand the cybersecurity really well. And those who understand the cybersecurity, they make a lot of money. So if you have young siblings, if you have kids in college, it's worth to look into the cybersecurity. With the new presence of robots now, and the systems, all being controlled by these very systems, computers, Linux and Windows, you want your kids to know about the cybersecurity. So that's something you need to look into, okay? great thing about open source. Number one, there's no dependability on your vendor. Let's say Microsoft or HP. There was another concern, like the Unix operating system, Sun OS operating system, the Solaris operating system. If the company gets sold and the company does not have funding anymore, you have hundreds and thousands of systems running the very operating system, which is the proprietary system, and the company gets sold or their shares sink. Guess what? If that company sinks, if the company does not exist anymore, guess what? Your hundreds of thousands of systems are in trouble because the code, the Unix operating system's code, is with the company itself. And if they're not there to support you, if they do not have the talent that created that operating system, you're going to have problem. You're not going to have a support on your operating system. But with the open source initiative, you don't have to worry about that anymore, because almost every single person, those who understand the code and the coding phenomena, they understand how the Linux operating system is built. And so, it's nothing hidden, So there's a community which is contributing to your Linux operating system and enhancing it, making those changes on every single day to improve it, the integrity and the security of the Linux operating system. So you don't have to worry about the vendor. What if the Red Hat is not there anymore? Their stock sinks or something happens to your CEO and the company is wiped out. As we have seen, a lot of companies get wiped out that are on the open market. You're not going to have those issues with Linux. That's a big game changer for companies. That gives them peace of mind. Like, they can hire a bunch of developers that understand the Linux kernel and the languages that build Linux, and they can maintain their own version of the Linux. That's a big game changer. And licensing costs, there is no licensing cost. Usually companies charge you for the support. They cannot charge you for the software. So that's another thing. So there's no vendor dependability. There's no licensing cost. And it is better operating system because there are millions of people contributing toward the main core, as opposed to thousands of people working for Microsoft or Sun Solaris or some other HP operating system. Does that make sense? It's very, very important. Okay. It is very, very important that you understand this, because this is the main point you're going to ask. If usually the interviewer starts out by asking you, so what is your favorite operating system? What do you use for home use? And then you say, I use Windows operating system or Linux. And then they would say, okay, so what do you think is the main difference between Linux and Unix and the other operating systems? And that's where you need to throw in the open source. And they want to hear this word open source. And now if you work with the open source, and so there are open source operating systems, there are open source applications as well. So companies realize that it's a great way to introduce the product to the customer, make it open source, let them see the source code. So the company is satisfied that there is no hidden agenda. Nobody is spying on us. There's no, a piece of the code which is going to spy on our networks and on our systems, right? And so once they have that peace of mind, open source softwares are usually free to download with some limited capacity sometimes, and that's how they make money. They give you some limited capacity, or they may say that you can use this application on a certain number of servers, and if you want to increase the number of applications, you need to pay us for that. And you need to pay us for this. Good question. Very good. I'm glad you asked this. So what is a vendor? A company that makes a product. That's called a vendor. For example, if you're so if you're looking for a bag to buy, the vendor is Louis Vuitton, is Christian Dior, is Gucci, right? So those are your vendors. And if you're looking for an operating system, your vendors that you're dealing with, if you're looking for the proprietary software, which the ones that do not give you the source code access and they have the licensing cost, those guys are right over here, Microsoft. and you also have a HP. Because their operating system, which is Windows in this case, and HP is a Unix in this case, because these guys do not release the source code, that means the customer, which is a company, whether it's AT&T, Google, Verizon, they're using this software, but they do not have the access to the source code. They are depending on the vendor. Why? Because if I'm a company and I have, let's say, hundreds and thousands of systems, by the way, an enterprise level company is going to have hundreds and thousands of servers. On daily basis, you're creating new servers, you hundreds and thousands of servers, and you are installing Windows on top of all of these systems, right? Because that's the first thing you need to install on your hardware. If you have the Windows running on your server, and now all of a sudden, something happened to Microsoft, something happens to Bill Gates, God forbid, or something, they do a big to all of these hundreds and thousands of systems because only Microsoft knew their product. Now there is no Microsoft, God forbid if that's the case, there is no support for your operating system. Therefore, you are running Windows on top of it. You may run it for another 6 months, a year, and as soon as somebody finds some hacking, some vulnerability means some weakness in the system, and they launch an attack against your systems, who very code to fix the vulnerability.